It's 2024, which seems like a good time to revisit a question I get a lot on this channel. How do you get into Star Wars comics for the first time? There are a ton of series to choose from, so it can easily feel like an overwhelming challenge. Similar to how I discussed getting into the Star Wars books in a previous video, I'm going to try to give you a handful of jumping off points based on my favorites. But first, let's talk about how to keep up with comics in the first place. I personally use Comixology on Amazon, which I think is just merging with Kindle. You can set up digital subscriptions and each new issue will show up to your computer or tablet every Wednesday. You can also look into Marvel Unlimited, which is a monthly subscription. I think it's about 6 months behind, so you won't be able to read brand new issues, but if you're getting into comics for the very first time, that shouldn't be a problem. My go-to recommendation for starting comics is Charles Soule's Darth Vader run from 2017. It's 25 issues long, and just about every single one was amazing. It picks up immediately after Revenge of the Sith and takes us through the construction of Fortress Vader on Mustafar. The writing is great, the art is great, the overall story is great. I think it's one of the best Star Wars comics of all time. If you want to stick with familiar characters, there are two options for the flagship Star Wars title. One tells us what Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewie got up to in between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back. The current run, which is also written by Charles Soule, is set in between Empire and Return of the Jedi. They're both long, ongoing series, and I would say they fluctuate in quality, but if you want to follow the main OT characters, those are the comics to read. If you want to stick with that era, but check out something a little weirder, or okay, a lot weirder, I would recommend reading either Dr. Aphra series, the first by Kieran Gillen or the current run by Alyssa Wong. Aphra is described as a rogue archaeologist, and she gets into some very fun adventures that often dive into ancient Star Wars lore. It's consistently been one of my favorite comics to read every month. But maybe you're looking for some prequel-era stories instead. Unfortunately, there aren't nearly as many options to choose from. The comics have largely stuck to the original trilogy era, but you can check out a handful of miniseries. I thought Darth Maul by Cullen Bunn was pretty great. There's another Charles Soule series called Obi-Wan and Anakin that's one of the few Star Wars stories we have set in between episodes 1 and 2, or more recently you can check out the Yoda miniseries that spanned hundreds of years of the Jedi Grandmaster's life. Kanan the Last Padawan by Greg Weisman is another strong option telling some Clone Wars era stories going through Order 66 and beyond, and it has one of my favorite comic moments in it revolving around Kanan and some of his former clone troopers. If you want to jump into the sequel trilogy era, again, there aren't a whole lot of options. I think the best choice there is The Rise of Kylo Ren, once again by Charles Soule. It's only 4 issues, but shows us some of Ben Solo's younger days training with Luke, what happened to him the night Luke's temple was destroyed, and how he became the Master of the Knights of Ren. There's a Poe Dameron series, also by Soule, that had some pretty great moments in it, covering about a year or so before the events of The Force Awakens. Basically, if you're looking for something to read, if you see the name Charles Soule on it, you're in good hands. For another miniseries, I would recommend his Lando run. It was only 5 issues, so it's a small commitment, but it shocked me how emotional it wound up being. The relationship between Lando and Lobot was fantastic, and it's still paying off in the main Star Wars run 8 years later. If you're wanting to step outside of the Skywalker saga, there are some excellent options in the High Republic. Cavan Scott's main run has been consistently great. These stories take place hundreds of years before The Phantom Menace, when the Jedi, the Republic, and the galaxy all looked very different. I do think the comics work best when paired with the books, but they largely follow separate characters, and you can follow just their story. Trail of Shadows by Daniel Jose Older is a noir detective story set in the same time period that you should absolutely include if you're diving into the High Republic. It is one of my favorite Star Wars comics. Finally, I'll talk a bit about Star Wars Legends and the old comics, mostly from Dark Horse. I have to admit, I'm not nearly as knowledgeable about them as I am the Legends books. I just didn't have access to them growing up. The books were all at my library, but for comics, I wound up reading the same issues of Dark Empire over and over at Media Play. I read that, Crimson Empire, Tales of the Jedi, and some X-Wing growing up, and liked them all, but that's pretty much it. So I'm definitely not trying to exclude Legends in this discussion, I just don't consider myself nearly that same level of authority on them. But I think I've given enough jumping off points, so I'll wrap up for today. I hope that helps some of you get into Star Wars comics for the very first time. Leave your own favorites in the comments. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on our socials, and consider checking out our Patreon page. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.